The first time Zexai encountered human military doctrine, she thought it was a translation error. No species in the known galaxy could be that paradoxical in their approach to warfare. As the chief xenobiologist aboard the hegemony research vessel Silent Truth, she had studied over 300 different sapient species across 47 systems. Each followed predictable patterns when it came to conflict: total domination, resource extraction, territorial expansion, or species preservation. Simple, logical, efficient. Humans defied every single paradigm. The initial contact had occurred 6 months ago when a human exploration vessel, the US Horizon, had stumbled into hegemony space near the Kepler 442 system. Standard first contact protocols had been followed. The humans were scanned, cataloged, and their basic technology assessed. They appeared to be a relatively young species, having achieved faster-than-light travel only recently. Their ships were crude but functional, their weapons primitive but effective. By all galactic standards, they should have been easy to categorize and, if necessary, subjugate. The Hegemony Council had dispatched a standard intimidation fleet, 37 warships, including 2 planet crackers and a full siege complement. The message was clear: submit to hegemony authority or face extinction. It was a routine that had played out countless times across the galaxy. Most species took one look at the overwhelming force and immediately surrendered. Those that didn't were typically reduced to radioactive dust within hours. The humans had done something unprecedented. They had requested a meeting. Zexai still remembered the disbelief in Fleet Admiral Court's voice when a human response came through the translation matrix. The humans wanted to discuss rules of engagement and acceptable military conduct. They had actually transmitted a document they called the Geneva Conventions, along with something called the Laws of Armed Conflict. Are they mocking us? Court had demanded, his 4 eyes rotating in agitation. Do they think we're here to play games? But Zexai had been intrigued. In all her years of xenobiological study, she had never encountered a species that attempted to regulate warfare. The concept was alien to her, more alien than any of the bizarre life forms she had cataloged in the Outer Rim territories. The meeting had been arranged on neutral ground, a small space station in the buffer zone between human and hegemony space. Zexai had been included in the delegation specifically to observe human behavior and provide psychological profiles for the military planners. The human delegation had been smaller than expected. Only 5 individuals, led by someone they called General Patricia Morrison. Zexai had immediately noted the peculiarity of their military structure. The humans had female commanders, another anomaly among galactic species where physical dominance typically determined leadership hierarchies. General Morrison was a compact human with graying hair and what Zexai species would have considered insufficient physical intimidation markers. She carried no visible weapons, wore a simple uniform with small metallic symbols, and spoke in calm, measured tones. By all biological indicators, she should have been submissive in the face of the hegemony's overwhelming military superiority. Instead, she had opened the negotiations with a statement that still haunted Zexai's sleep cycles. Before we discuss terms of engagement, Morrison had said, "We need to establish rules that all parties will follow. We understand you have superior numbers and firepower. We're prepared to acknowledge that reality. However, any conflict between our peoples must adhere to certain fundamental principles regarding the treatment of prisoners, protection of civilians, and limitations on weapons of mass destruction." Fleet Admiral Court had literally laughed. His translator had struggled to convey the concept of amusement mixed with contempt. "You are in no position to make demands, human. Your entire species could be eliminated before your next sunrise." Morrison had nodded calmly. "That's true. You could destroy us. But the question is whether you want to be the kind of species that exterminates entire populations of noncombatants. More importantly, do you want to face what comes after?" After, Court's tentacles had writhed in confusion. There would be no after. You would be extinct. General Morrison, Zexai had interjected, unable to contain her scientific curiosity. "Are you threatening some form of posthumous revenge?" a dead-hand system of automated retaliation. The human had turned those strange binocular eyes toward her, and Zexai had felt an unexpected chill. There was something in that gaze, not madness, not desperation, but a kind of cold calculation that seemed to operate on principles she couldn't comprehend. Not revenge, Morrison had replied. Justice and precedent. If you genocide us, you establish that genocide is an acceptable tool of galactic politics. Other species will take note. They'll learn that the hegemony's word means nothing, that your treaties are worthless, that might makes right in all circumstances. Some of them might decide they need to strike first before you decide they're inconvenient. Court had dismissed this with a gesture. Fear keeps species in line. It's the foundation of galactic order. Is it? Morrison had pulled out a small datapad. Because according to our preliminary surveys of this region, you're currently dealing with insurgencies in 12 different systems, 3 proxy wars between client species, and at least 2 independence movements that have acquired Planet Buster technology through black market channels. How's that fear-based order working out? The silence that had followed was profound. Zexai realized that the humans had done something the hegemony's vast intelligence networks had failed to accomplish. They had connected the dots. They saw the pattern of increasing resistance, the way fear bred desperation, and desperation bred increasingly dangerous gambles. What are you proposing? Court had asked, and Zexai noticed his translator had difficulty conveying the subtle shift in his tone from dismissive to cautious. Morrison had activated her datapad, and the room's holographic display had come alive with text. Zexai watched in fascination as page after page of detailed regulations scrolled past. Restrictions on targeting civilian populations. Requirements for prisoner treatment. Prohibitions on certain types of weapons. Procedures for surrender and negotiation. Medical neutrality. Protection of cultural sites. These are our minimum requirements for any military engagement, Morrison had said. They're non-negotiable. Non negociable. Court's voice had risen to what Zexai recognized as a combat pitch. You're outnumbered 1,000 to 1. Numbers aren't everything, Morrison had replied calmly. You have to ask yourself, what kind of war do you want to fight? A clean military engagement with clear objectives and rules that both sides can live with? Or a chaotic bloodbath that sets a precedent for every future conflict in this galaxy? Zexai had found herself leaning forward, her primary manipulators unconsciously taking notes. This was unprecedented in her experience. The humans were negotiating from a position of absolute weakness, yet somehow they had shifted the dynamic. They weren't begging for mercy or trying to intimidate with hidden weapons. They were appealing to concepts that didn't exist in hegemony military doctrine. Ethics, long-term consequences, and something they kept calling the greater good. You speak of precedent, Cord had said slowly. But precedent flows from power. We have the power. Do you? Morrison had gestured to the display. Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like your power is creating more problems than it solves. Every species you've conquered remembers. Every population you've displaced dreams of revenge. Every world you've strip-mined becomes a potential recruit for your enemies. Power without legitimacy is just violence with better organization. The concept of legitimacy was another anomaly. Zexai had studied hundreds of species, and she had never encountered one that questioned the moral authority of superior force. The strong ruled the weak. This was universal law, as fundamental as gravity or entropy. Yet the humans seemed to operate under an entirely different framework. What makes your way superior? Court had demanded. Your species is fragmented. Your worlds are in constant conflict. Your governments change leadership through ritualized combat you call elections. You have no unity, no clear hierarchy, no efficient command structure. Morrison had smiled, and Zexai noted that human facial expressions were far more complex than their preliminary studies had indicated. The smile contained elements of amusement, sadness, and something else, perhaps pride? You're right about all of that, Morrison had admitted. We're chaotic, argumentative, and inefficient. We fight among ourselves constantly. Our decision-making processes are slow and complicated. But here's the thing about our chaos. It makes us adaptable. When one approach fails, we try another. When one leader makes mistakes, we replace them. When one idea proves wrong, we develop better ideas. Chaos is weakness, Court had insisted. Is it? Let me ask you something, Admiral. How long has the hegemony existed in its current form? 47,000 standard years. And in all that time, has your military doctrine changed significantly? Court had paused, clearly struggling with the concept. Why would it change? It works. Does it? Because from our analysis, your expansion has stalled. Your casualty rates in subjugation campaigns have increased by 300% over the last millennium. Your client species are becoming increasingly restive. Your logistics networks are overstretched. Your command structure is so rigid that field commanders can't adapt to local conditions without approval from headquarters. Zexai had felt a chill run through her secondary nervous system. The humans had analyzed the hegemony's military performance with frightening accuracy. How had a species that had only recently achieved FTL travel managed such a comprehensive assessment? How do you know all of this? She had asked. Morrison had turned those unsettling eyes on her again. We study. It's what we do. When we encounter a new problem, we research it from every possible angle. We look at historical patterns, analyze current data, and try to predict future trends. Then we argue about it until we arrive at the best possible solution. But you've only had contact with us for 6 months, Court had protested. 6 months is enough time to gather a lot of information if you know what to look for. Your previous campaigns are well documented. Your fleet movements follow predictable patterns. Your communication protocols have systematic vulnerabilities. Your psychology is remarkably uniform across command ranks. The casual way Morrison delivered this intelligence assessment had sent shock waves through the hegemony delegation. They had been observed, analyzed, and categorized with the same clinical efficiency they typically applied to potential conquest targets. Are you threatening us? Court had asked, his translator struggling with the complex mix of anger and uncertainty in his voice. No, I admitted. We're offering you a choice. You can continue using the same tactics that worked 40,000 years ago against primitive species with no FTL capability. Or you can adapt to a new reality where your opponents study your methods, learn from your successes and failures, and develop countermeasures. Morrison had gestured to the holographic display again. These rules of engagement aren't just about morality, though that's certainly part of it. They're about creating a framework for conflict that benefits everyone involved. When both sides know what lines can't be crossed, when prisoners are treated humanely, when civilian populations are protected, wars become limited, manageable affairs instead of existential threats. You want to make war civilized? Zexai had found herself asking. We want to make war unnecessary, Morrison had corrected. But when it can't be avoided, yes, we want it to follow rules that preserve the possibility of peace afterward. If you exterminate us, you can't learn from us. If we exterminate you, we can't benefit from your knowledge and experience. Mutual destruction serves no one's interests. Court had been quiet for several minutes, clearly struggling with concepts that had no equivalent in hegemony thinking. Finally, he had spoken. What you're describing, it would require trust. Trust that your opponents will follow the same rules you do. Trust has to start somewhere, Morrison had replied, usually with someone willing to extend it first. And if that trust is betrayed, Morrison's expression had grown serious. Then, you respond proportionally within the framework of established law, and you document the violation for future reference. But you don't abandon the entire system because of one bad actor. The meeting had continued for several more hours, with the humans methodically addressing every objection the hegemony delegation raised. They had answers for everything, not just glib responses, but detailed analyses that demonstrated deep understanding of the implications and consequences of their proposals. When the session finally ended, Zexai had found herself more confused than when it began. Everything in her training, her experience, her understanding of how intelligent species operated, told her the human approach was naive and doomed to failure. Species competed for resources, territory, and survival. Cooperation was a luxury that evolution had bred out of most intelligent life. Yet the humans had somehow built a civilization that spanned dozens of worlds despite being fractured into competing nation-states. They had achieved technological progress that rivaled species with thousands of years more development time. And they had approached the most powerful military force in known space not with submission or defiance, but with a proposal for systematic reform. As Zexhai prepared her initial report, she realized she was facing a problem that no xenobiologist had ever encountered before. She was studying a species that might be more advanced than her own, not in terms of technology or military power, but in ways she was only beginning to understand. The humans called it civilization. The hegemony called it weakness. Zexhai was beginning to suspect they might both be wrong. Her report would have to wait until she understood what she had witnessed. And understanding the humans she was learning required abandoning everything she thought she knew about how intelligent life operated in the universe. The human military base on Kepler 442b was nothing like what Zexhai expected. She had been granted unprecedented access as part of the cultural exchange program that emerged from those first negotiations 3 months ago. Fleet Admiral Court, against the advice of his entire general staff, had agreed to a limited trial of human rules of engagement in a joint operation against pirate raiders in the Veil Nebula. The results had been so anomalous that the Hegemony High Command demanded a full investigation. Zexhai found herself assigned as the primary observer, tasked with understanding how the humans had achieved a 93% casualty reduction while simultaneously increasing mission success rates by 240%. The base itself challenged every assumption about military efficiency. Instead of the sterile, hierarchical compound she knew from hegemony installations, the human facility buzzed with an energy that seemed almost chaotic. Personnel moved freely between sections, engaged in animated discussions, and displayed a casual disregard for traditional rank protocols that should have resulted in complete breakdown of command authority. Yet somehow it worked. Commander Sarah Chun, her assigned liaison, had been explaining human military doctrine while leading her through the Tactical Planning Center. Unlike hegemony command structures where orders flowed downward through rigid chains of authority, the humans seemed to operate through something they called mission-type orders. We tell our people what needs to be accomplished and why, Chun explained, pausing beside a holographic display showing the Veil Nebula operation. Then, we'll let them figure out the best way to do it. Zexhai watched junior officers, some barely past juvenile status by her species standards, actively debating strategy with senior commanders. In the hegemony, such behavior would be considered insubordination punishable by neural reconditioning. Here, it seemed to be encouraged. But how do you maintain discipline? She asked. How do you ensure orders are followed? Chun smiled, that complex human expression Zexhai was learning to interpret. We don't give orders that can't be followed. We give missions that make sense. When people understand why they're being asked to do something, they're more likely to do it effectively. The concept was alien. Hegemony military doctrine was based on absolute obedience to hierarchy. Soldiers were not expected to understand strategy, only to execute orders with mechanical precision. It was efficient, predictable, and had conquered half the galaxy. During the Veil Nebula operation, Zexhai said, consulting her datapad, your forces encountered 17 different tactical scenarios that weren't covered in the operational plan. How did they respond without specific orders? They improvised, Chun replied casually. That's what we train them to do. Zexhai felt her primary manipulators twitch with confusion. Improvisation suggests deviation from established protocol. How do you maintain operational coherence? Chun led her to another display, this one showing a real-time replay of the Veil Nebula engagement. Watch Sergeant Williams here, she said, highlighting one of the human soldiers. His squad encountered a group of pirate ships using civilian freighters as shields. Standard hegemony protocol would have been to destroy the pirates regardless of collateral damage, correct? HFY Narrator. Civilian casualties were regrettable, but acceptable when weighed against mission objectives and force preservation. Williams had about 30 seconds to make a decision. Chun continued. He could follow the tactical plan and risk destroying the civilian ships, or he could improvise. Watch what he did. The tactical display showed Williams' squad breaking formation, using their superior maneuverability to position themselves between the pirates and the civilian ships. Instead of engaging immediately, they broadcast surrender demands while simultaneously targeting the pirates' weapon systems with precision shots that disabled rather than destroyed. The result, Chun said, was 12 pirate vessels captured intact, 47 civilian lives saved, and 0 friendly casualties. Plus, interrogation of the captured pirates led to intelligence that allowed us to shut down 3 more raider bases. HFY studied the data feeds with growing bewilderment, but he violated the tactical plan. He exposed his forces to unnecessary risk. He prioritized unknown civilians over mission objectives and achieved better results than the plan would have delivered, Chun pointed out. That's the power of adaptive thinking. Williams understood the mission objective, eliminate the pirate threat, and found a way to accomplish it while also adhering to our rules of engagement. Those rules again. HFY had been studying the human legal framework for weeks, and it continued to baffle her. The documents were incredibly detailed, covering everything from proper treatment of prisoners to acceptable target selection to post-conflict reconstruction responsibilities. They seemed designed to make warfare as difficult and inefficient as possible. Commander Chun, she said carefully, I must ask a question that may seem offensive. Why do you deliberately handicap yourselves with these restrictions? You could achieve faster victories with fewer casualties if you simply eliminated civilian populations in combat zones. Chen's expression grew serious, and HFY detected the complex emotional indicators she was learning to recognize in humans. Sadness mixed with determination, along with something else, perhaps pity? Because victories achieved through atrocities aren't really victories, Chen replied. They're just temporary dominance. When you terrorize a population into submission, you create enemies that will fight you for generations. When you disregard the rules of civilized warfare, you give your opponents permission to do the same. She gestured toward another display showing post-conflict statistics from various hegemony campaigns. Look at these numbers. How many subjugated systems have experienced uprisings in the past century? HFY consulted her own databanks. The figures were troubling. 43 major rebellions, hundreds of smaller insurgencies, and an overall pattern of increasing resistance to hegemony authority. Rebellion is expected, she said defensively. It's the price of expansion. Is it? Chun brought up comparative data from human colonial territories. We've established settlements on 37 worlds over the past 2 centuries. Our rebellion rate is less than 1%, and most of those were resolved through negotiation rather than force. But you allow local autonomy, HFY protested. You don't impose unified governance. Exactly. We learned early that trying to control everything creates more problems than it solves. It's more efficient to establish frameworks for cooperation and let local populations manage their own affairs within those frameworks. The conversation was interrupted by an alert tone. A young human officer, Lieutenant Rodriguez, according to his identification tags, approached their position. Commander, he said, his tone respectful, but not servile, we've received a distress signal from a hegemony patrol vessel in the outer reach. They're under attack by unknown forces and requesting assistance. Chen turned to HFY. This will be a perfect opportunity for you to observe our response protocols in action. Are you interested? HFY's sensory appendages fluttered with curiosity. A chance to see human military doctrine in real-time action against an actual threat? Yes, absolutely. Within minutes, She found herself in the command center, watching the humans mobilize their response force. What she observed challenged every assumption about military efficiency she had ever held. Instead of a single commander issuing orders to subordinates, she witnessed something that resembled organized chaos. Multiple specialists simultaneously analyzed the threat data, developed response options, and coordinated resource allocation. The process was noisy, seemingly disorganized, and completely unlike the sterile precision of hegemony command protocols. Yet somehow, it worked with frightening effectiveness. Analysis indicates 12 attacker vessels, unknown configuration, reported tactical specialist Martinez. They're using some kind of jamming technology that's interfering with the patrol sensors and communications. Nearest hegemony reinforcements? Chen asked. 4 hours out at best speed, communications officer Park replied. The patrol won't last that long against those odds. What about our forces? Rodriguez asked. We could have a response squadron there in 90 minutes. Chen paused, and Zexai watched her consider the tactical and political implications. A human force rescuing a hegemony patrol would be unprecedented. It could be seen as interference, aggression, or worse. Zexai, Chen said suddenly, this is your call. It's your people in danger. What are the political ramifications if we intervene? The question stunned her. In hegemony hierarchy, junior personnel never asked senior officials to make strategic decisions. The very idea of a human commander deferring to an alien observer violated every protocol she knew. I'm not qualified to make such decisions, she stammered. You're the senior hegemony representative present, Chen replied calmly. You understand your people's politics better than we do. We're willing to help, but we won't act without understanding the consequences. Zexai felt her reasoning matrices racing through possibilities. The patrol vessel belonged to the 47th Fleet, commanded by Admiral Vextar, a hardline traditionalist who viewed humans as barely evolved primitives. If human forces rescued his people, it could either demonstrate human competence or be interpreted as an insult to hegemony military capability. But 37 hegemony personnel were about to die if no action was taken. Send the rescue force, she decided. I'll take responsibility for any political complications. Chen nodded crisply. Rodriguez, prep Squadron 7 for immediate deployment. Rules of engagement. Standard humanitarian mission, Rodriguez replied immediately. Protect and extract friendly forces, minimize casualties among all parties, follow Geneva protocols. What about the attackers? Martinez asked. Do we know who they are or what they want? Negative, Park reported. But initial energy signatures suggest they might be using modified hegemony technology. Could be renegade forces or black market acquisitions. Chen frowned. That complicates things. If they're using hegemony tech against hegemony forces, there might be a political dimension we're not seeing. She turned to Zexai again. Any insights into who might be attacking your patrol? Zexai accessed her intelligence databases, cross-referencing recent insurgent activity with the patrol's operational area. The 47th Fleet has been conducting pacification operations in the outer reach for the past 6 months. They've encountered resistance from several species that object to resource extraction in their territories. Chen said softly. So this might not be random piracy. It could be targeted retaliation. Does that change your response? Zexai asked. Chen exchanged glances with her officers. It changes our approach. If this is a political conflict rather than simple piracy, we need to be careful not to escalate things. We're rescuing your people, but we're not taking sides in whatever dispute led to this attack. Rodriguez nodded. Rules of engagement update. Minimum necessary force. Attempt communication with attackers. Document everything for post-action analysis. As Zexai watched Squadron 7 launch, she realized she was witnessing something unprecedented in her experience. The humans were risking their own personnel to save hegemony forces they had no obligation to protect, while simultaneously working to avoid escalating a conflict they weren't party to. They were considering political implications, legal ramifications, and long-term consequences even in the midst of a crisis. It was exactly the kind of complex, inefficient thinking that should have resulted in analysis paralysis and mission failure. Instead, the Human Response Force was already accelerating toward the crisis zone with a clear mission and flexible parameters that would allow them to adapt to whatever situation they encountered. "Commander," she said slowly, "I think I'm beginning to understand something about your species." Chen looked at her expectantly. "You don't just fight wars," Zexai continued. "You think about what comes after the fighting stops. Even in the middle of a crisis, you're considering consequences that might not manifest for years or decades." "That's the point of having laws of war," Chen replied. "They force you to think beyond immediate tactical objectives. They remind you that today's enemy might be tomorrow's ally, that today's victory might be tomorrow's problem, and that how you fight is as important as whether you win." As if summoned by her words, communications crackled with an incoming transmission. "Command, this is Angel 7. We've reached the patrol vessel. Attackers are withdrawing at our approach. No shots fired. Repeat, attackers are withdrawing without engagement." Chen's eyebrows rose. "Interesting. Park, give me a comm channel to the attacking force. Establishing connection, link open. Unknown vessels. This is Commander Chun of the Human Defense Force. We're here to assist with a humanitarian emergency. We have no interest in your political dispute with the hegemony. Please identify yourselves and state your intentions." A brief pause, then, "Human ship, this is Fleet Master Keth of the Free Worlds Alliance. We were unaware that humans had become involved in this sector. Our quarrel is with the hegemony occupation forces, not with your people." Zexai felt her secondary heart skip a beat. The Free World Alliance was a coalition of species that had rejected hegemony membership and formed their own loose confederation. They weren't pirates. They were insurgents fighting what they considered an illegal occupation of their space. "Fleet Master Keth," Chun continued smoothly, "we're not here to take sides in your conflict. We're here because people were in danger. Once we've ensured the safety of all personnel, we'll withdraw from the area." "Understood, Commander. We have no quarrel with the human way of war. You may proceed." The transmission ended, leaving the command center in thoughtful silence. Rodriguez finally spoke. "Did he just say the human way of war? Like it's a recognized thing?" Chen looked at Zexai. "Any idea what that might mean?" Zexai's knowledge matrices were already searching for references. What she found sent chills through her nervous system. There have been discussions in various political circles about human military doctrine. Some species seem to view it as a legitimate alternative to traditional conquest-based expansion. "Alternative to what we do, you mean?" Chen said quietly. "Yes. You're developing a reputation as a species that fights to solve problems rather than to dominate opponents. Some populations under hegemony control are interested in that approach." The implications hung in the air like a toxic cloud. The humans weren't just offering an alternative to hegemony military doctrine. They were offering an alternative to the entire hegemony system of galactic governance. And other species were paying attention. Zexai realized that her mission had just become infinitely more complex. She wasn't just studying human military efficiency. She was witnessing the birth of a new model for interspecies relations, one that could fundamentally challenge everything the hegemony represented. The question was whether her superiors would see this as an opportunity to learn or a threat to be eliminated. 2 weeks after the Outer Reach incident, Zexai found herself standing in the most unusual facility she had ever encountered, a human prisoner of war camp. The facility on Luna Base 7 housed 43 captured hegemony personnel for various skirmishes, along with 17 Free World Alliance fighters and 26 pirates from the Veil Nebula raids. What shocked her wasn't the existence of the facility. Every military force maintained detention centers for captured enemies. What shocked her was how the humans operated it. "The prisoners are housed according to rank and species requirements," explained Dr. Elizabeth Kane, the facility's administrator. Kane held what the humans called a dual commission. She was both a military officer and a civilian humanitarian specialist. Another impossible contradiction in hegemony terms. Your people, Kane continued, gesturing toward a section of the facility, required specific atmospheric and gravitational adjustments. We've also provided access to their religious texts and dietary accommodations. Zexai studied the detention area through the observation portal. The hegemony prisoners were not in individual cells as she expected, but in communal areas that resembled military barracks more than dungeons. They were reading, exercising, and engaging in what appeared to be normal social interaction. They don't seem to be suffering, she observed. That's the point, Kane replied. The Geneva Conventions require that prisoners of war be treated humanely. They're not criminals. They're enemy combatants who were doing their duty as soldiers. There's a difference. The concept of treating enemy prisoners with respect was so foreign to Zexai's experience that she struggled to process it. In hegemony detention facilities, captured enemies were subjected to neural scanning for intelligence extraction, followed by either reconditioning for labor service or execution if they were deemed too dangerous to reprogram. But how do you extract intelligence from them? She asked. Kane's expression grew troubled. We don't. Torture and coercive interrogation are prohibited under our laws of war. If prisoners volunteer information, we can accept it, but we can't force them to cooperate. Then, how do you gather operational intelligence about enemy capabilities and intentions? Through other means: observation, communication intercepts, analysis of captured equipment, voluntary debriefing of defectors. There are plenty of ways to gather intelligence that don't involve violating the rights of prisoners. They moved to another section of the facility where the Free World Alliance fighters were housed. Zexai noticed immediately that these prisoners were not segregated from the hegemony personnel as military logic would dictate. The different species were interacting freely, even cooperatively. Aren't you concerned about conflicts between enemy factions? She asked. Initially, yes, Kane admitted. But something interesting happened. When prisoners from opposing sides are treated equally and humanely, they tend to focus on their shared circumstances rather than their past conflicts. We've actually had instances where former enemies have collaborated on educational projects or cultural exchanges. As if to illustrate her point, they observed a group consisting of 2 hegemony naval officers, a Free World Alliance pilot, and a human guard engaged in an animated discussion over a holographic display showing stellar cartography. Lieutenant Torres is helping them understand human navigation systems, Kane explained. In return, they're sharing information about local stellar phenomena that our charts don't include. Everyone benefits. The scene was so contrary to everything Zexai understood about prisoner management that she felt her reasoning circuits struggling to process it. But they're enemies. How can you trust them not to use this information against you? Kane's smile with that complex human expression that Zexai was learning indicated both amusement and sadness. Because we're going to release them eventually. Under the Geneva Conventions, prisoners of war must be repatriated when hostilities end. We want them to go home with positive impressions of human civilization, not traumatic memories that will fuel future conflicts. You're going to release them? All of them. Of course. They're soldiers, not criminals. When the current conflicts are resolved, they'll return to their respective governments or civilian lives. Zexai felt her primary manipulators trembling with confusion. But they know about your facilities, your procedures, your personnel. They could provide intelligence to your enemies. They could, Kane agreed. But they'll also know that humans treat prisoners with dignity and respect. They'll know that we follow our own laws, even when dealing with people who consider us enemies. That knowledge is worth more than any tactical intelligence they might possess. They continued the tour, and Zexai observed facilities that challenged every assumption about prisoner management. There was a library with texts in multiple languages and formats, a communication center where prisoners could send messages to their families, a medical facility where human doctors treated prisoners with the same care they would provide to their own personnel. Dr. Kane, she said finally, I must ask about the practical implications of this approach. Maintaining these facilities must be enormously expensive. The security requirements, the specialized equipment, the personnel costs. Surely it would be more efficient to simply eliminate captured enemies. Kane stopped walking and turned to face her directly. Zexai, can I ask you something personal? The request was unexpected. Personal questions between species were rarely appropriate in formal diplomatic contexts. I suppose so. Do you have offspring? Family members you care about? Yes. I have 2 spawned siblings and 3 genetic offspring. If they were captured by an enemy force, would you want them to be treated with dignity? Fed properly? Allowed to maintain contact with you? Given medical care if they were injured? The question created uncomfortable resonance in Zexai's emotional matrix. The thought of her offspring in enemy hands was deeply disturbing, made worse by the knowledge of how hegemony forces typically treated prisoners. Of course I would want them treated well, she admitted. Then, you understand the principle, Kane said gently. We treat prisoners humanely because we hope our enemies will extend the same courtesy to our people if they're captured. But even if they don't, we do it because it's right. Because maintaining our moral principles is more important than short-term tactical advantages. They entered a conference room where several prisoners were meeting with human legal representatives. Zexai observed with fascination as the humans carefully documented the prisoners' treatment, investigated any complaints, and ensured that all procedures followed established protocols. You have lawyers representing enemy prisoners? She asked. Every prisoner has the right to legal representation, Kane confirmed. If they believe their treatment violates established conventions, they can file formal complaints that will be investigated by neutral parties. Neutral parties? Who could be neutral in a conflict between humans and other species? Kane activated a holographic display showing an organizational chart. The Interspecies Committee for Humanitarian Law. It's a new organization that several species have joined to monitor compliance with prisoner treatment standards. The Free World Alliance is a member, and we've extended an invitation to the hegemony. Zexai studied the display with growing amazement. The humans hadn't just adopted laws of war for themselves. They were working to create galactic institutions to enforce those laws across all species. They were attempting to fundamentally restructure how interspecies conflicts were conducted. Has the hegemony responded to this invitation? Kane's expression grew diplomatic. The response has been reserved. There seems to be some concern about submitting hegemony practices to external oversight. Of course there was. The hegemony's prisoner treatment protocols will be considered war crimes under any civilized standard. The implications of joining such an organization would require complete restructuring of their military justice system. Dr. Kane, Zexai said carefully, may I speak with some of the prisoners? Particularly the hegemony personnel? Certainly, though I should warn you that some of them have expressed complex feelings about their situation. They approached a group of hegemony naval officers who were engaged in what appeared to be a tactical discussion. When they noticed Zexai approaching, their conversation stopped abruptly. Intelligence Specialist Zexai, said Commander Veltar, the senior officer present. Have you come to arrange our repatriation? I'm here as an observer, Zexai replied carefully. I'm studying human military doctrine. How are you being treated? Veltar exchanged glances with his companions, clearly uncomfortable with the question. We are confused by our situation. In what way? We expected to be interrogated, processed, and either executed or conditioned for labor service. Instead, we have been provided with comfortable quarters, adequate nutrition, recreational activities, and medical care. We are permitted to maintain our rank structure, practice our religious observances, and communicate with our families. Another officer, Lieutenant Zach High, spoke up. The humans claim they will release us when hostilities end, without conditioning or neuromodification. This seems impossible. Why impossible? Because, Veltar said slowly, we have seen their facilities, their procedures, their personnel. We know details about their defensive capabilities and operational methods. By any reasonable military standard, we should be considered permanent security risks. Zexai felt her understanding matrices struggling with the implications. Yet they plan to release you anyway. So if they claim, Zexai said, but there must be deception involved. No rational species would voluntarily compromise their security in such a manner. Before Zexai could respond, a human guard approached their group. Excusen, Commander Veltar. Your legal representative would like to discuss the appeal you filed regarding dietary restrictions. My legal representative? Veltar asked, clearly struggling with the concept. Yes, sir. Ms. Rodriguez from the Interspecies Legal Aid Society. She's reviewed your complaint about the lack of fermented protein supplements in your meals and believes she can arrange for proper substitutes to be imported. The guard departed, leaving the hegemony officers staring after him in bewilderment. They have provided us with lawyers, Zexai said in a tone that suggested he couldn't quite believe his own words. Human lawyers who are advocating for our rights against human authorities. The concept is incomprehensible. Veltar nodded slowly. We are beginning to understand why so many species speak of the human way of war. They fight not to destroy their enemies, but to convert them. Convert them to what? Zexai asked. To their way of thinking, Veltar replied. They demonstrate through action that their principles are superior to ours. They show rather than tell. And the demonstration is compelling. Zexai spent several more hours interviewing prisoners from all factions. The pattern that emerged was consistent and deeply troubling from a hegemony perspective. The humans weren't just treating prisoners humanely as a tactical consideration. They were modeling an entirely different approach to interspecies relations. The prisoners were being exposed to human concepts of law, justice, individual rights, and collective responsibility. They were seeing a society that valued ethical behavior, even when it came at tactical cost. They were experiencing respect and dignity from their captors. When they were eventually released, they would carry these experiences back to their home populations. They would tell stories about humans who treated enemies as people deserving of basic dignity. They would compare human prisoner treatment to their own government's practices. Some would become advocates for reform. Others would question the legitimacy of systems that relied on fear and brutality. A few might even become allies, convinced that human civilization offered something better than what they had known. It was a form of warfare that operated on timescales measured in decades rather than months. The humans weren't just fighting for immediate tactical objectives. They were fighting for the future character of galactic civilization. As Zexai prepared to leave Luna Base 7, Dr. Kane offered a final observation. You know, Zexai, the most important thing about treating prisoners humanely isn't the effect it has on them. It's the effect it has on us. What do you mean? When you dehumanize your enemies, you diminish your own humanity. When you treat them like animals, you become more animal-like yourself. The laws of war aren't just about protecting prisoners. They're about protecting the moral character of the people who enforce them. Kane gestured toward the facility around them. Every person who works here learns that even enemies deserve basic dignity. Every guard who treats prisoners with respect becomes a better person. Every administrator who ensures fair treatment develops a stronger commitment to justice. The principles we practice in war shape the kind of society we build in peace. Zexai left Luna Base 7 with her understanding of human civilization fundamentally altered. She had expected to study military efficiency and tactical innovation. Instead, she had discovered something far more profound. A species that had learned to weaponize compassion, to turn ethical behavior into strategic advantage, and to fight wars in ways that made peace more likely rather than less. The implications were staggering. If the human approach spread to other species, it could transform the nature of galactic politics. But it would also threaten every authoritarian system that relied on fear and brutality to maintain control, including the hegemony itself. The emergency session of the Hegemony High Command convened 3 days after Zexai submitted her preliminary report. She found herself standing before the most powerful military leaders in known space. her data cores trembling with nervous energy as she faced their collective scrutiny. Supreme Commander Maltex dominated the chamber from his elevated platform, his 12 eyes focusing on her with predatory intensity. Around him sat the other members of the High Command, Fleet Admiral Court, whom she knew from the original negotiations, Intelligence Director Quexhai, whose reputation for ruthless efficiency was legendary, and Strategic Coordinator Vexmat, the architect of the hegemony's expansion doctrine. Intelligence Specialist Zexhai. Maltex began, his voice carrying the harmonic undertones that indicated extreme displeasure. Your report contains claims that strain credibility. Are you certain of your observations? Yes, Supreme Commander. I have documented evidence for all conclusions. Evidence, Vexmat interjected, that suggests human military doctrine is somehow superior to proven hegemony methods. This seems unlikely given their technological primitiveness and recent emergence as a space-faring species. Zexhai activated her data projector, filling the chamber with holographic displays showing casualty statistics, mission success rates, and prisoner treatment protocols. The evidence speaks for itself. Human methods achieve better outcomes with lower costs across all measurable parameters. Lower costs in terms of immediate resources, Quexhai said, her cybernetic implants gleaming as she processed the data streams. But what about long-term strategic implications? Surely their humanitarian approach creates vulnerabilities that can be exploited. That's what I expected to find, Zexhai admitted. However, my analysis indicates the opposite. Their methods seem to create strategic advantages rather than vulnerabilities. The chamber fell silent, except for the subtle harmonics of the High Command's breathing apparatus. Supreme Commander Maltex leaned forward, his massive form casting shadows across the assembly. Explain, he commanded. Zexhai took a stabilizing breath and began presenting the most dangerous intelligence she had ever gathered. The humans have achieved something we thought impossible. They've made their enemies want to be conquered. The statement hung in the air like a toxic gas. Fleet Admiral Court's tentacles writhed in agitation. Impossible. Conquest creates resistance. It's a fundamental law of expansion dynamics. Not if the conquest improves the conquered population situation, Zexhai replied. The humans don't destroy existing social structures. They integrate them. They don't extract all available resources. They develop sustainable exploitation methods that benefit both parties. They don't eliminate local leadership. They co-opt it through incentive alignment. She highlighted a series of data streams showing human colonial territories. Their expansion rate has accelerated dramatically over the past 50 years, but their military expenditures have decreased. They're achieving conquest through economic and cultural attraction rather than military force. Vexmat's voice carried dangerous undertones. You're describing subversion, not conquest. I'm describing evolution, Zexhai corrected. They've developed beyond the crude, force-based expansion we've relied on for 40,000 years. They're using more sophisticated methods that achieve better results. Intelligence Director Quexhai's implants flickered as she accessed restricted databases. Our monitoring stations have detected increased communication between human territories and several hegemony client systems. Are you suggesting these communications represent subversive activities? Zexhai felt her secondary hearts racing. This was the most classified aspect of her investigation, the discovery that could either transform hegemony doctrine or result in her immediate termination. The communications are cultural and educational exchanges, she said carefully. Humans share technology, art, literature, and philosophical concepts freely with any species that expresses interest. They're not trying to subvert hegemony authority. They're offering alternatives to it. And species are responding to these offers. Maltex asked, his voice deceptively calm. 47% of hegemony client species have established some form of communication with human territories. 12% have formally requested inclusion in human trade networks. 3% have petitioned for full political integration with human space. The silence that followed was profound and terrifying. Zexhai could sense the complex emotions radiating from the high command: anger, fear, confusion, and something that might have been envy. 3%, Quexhai repeated slowly. How many systems does that represent? Approximately 800 worlds across 17 star systems. Fleet Admiral Court's translator struggled to convey the complexity of his emotional response. 800 worlds want to abandon hegemony protection for alliance with a species they've never met. They've met humans through cultural exchange programs, trade delegations, and educational partnerships, Zexhai explained. The humans have systematically demonstrated that their governance model produces better outcomes for member populations. Supreme Commander Maltex rose from his platform, his imposing form towering over the assembly. Show us specific examples of these better outcomes. Zexhai activated a series of comparative displays showing economic, social, and technological development indices for various systems. The Kepler 438 system joined the Human Trade Network 18 months ago. Their agricultural productivity has increased by 230%. Infant mortality has dropped by 91%. Educational attainment has improved across all demographic segments. Most significantly, crime rates have declined to near zero. Impossible vexmat protested. No system achieves zero crime rates without massive surveillance and behavioral conditioning programs. The humans use neither, Zexhai replied. They achieve social stability through economic opportunity, educational access, and participatory governance. When people have good reasons to support their government, they don't rebel against it. She brought up another data set. The Tau Ceti colonies present an even more striking example. 5 years ago, they were a standard hegemony resource extraction operation. 87% of the population lived in subsistence conditions, while 93% of system output was exported to hegemony core worlds. The display showed the dramatic transformation that occurred when the Tau Ceti system joined the Human Alliance. Under human governance, 62% of system output remains in-system for local development. The remaining 38% is traded for technology, education, and infrastructure improvements. The population has achieved living standards comparable to hegemony core worlds while maintaining their cultural autonomy. Intelligence Director Quexhai's implants buzzed with activity as she processed the implications. You're describing a governance model that's more efficient than ours. That's theoretically impossible. We've optimized our systems over 40,000 years. We've optimized for extraction and control, Zexhai corrected. The humans have optimized for stability and growth. Different objectives produce different solutions. The chamber's atmosphere grew increasingly tense as the High Command grappled with information that challenged their fundamental assumptions about galactic governance. Zexhai knew she was approaching the most dangerous part of her presentation, but she had no choice except to continue. There's another aspect of human doctrine that requires urgent attention, she said. Their military expansion strategy appears to be designed specifically to counter hegemony force structures. This caught their immediate attention. Supreme Commander Maltex fixed his primary eyes on her. Explain. Humans avoid large-scale fleet engagements. Instead, they use small, highly mobile forces that target our supply lines, communication nodes, and administrative centers. They don't try to hold territory. They try to make territory ungovernable. She displayed tactical analyses from recent skirmishes. In every engagement, they prioritize information warfare over kinetic destruction. They broadcast their laws of war, their prisoner treatment protocols, and their governance principles directly to our forces. They're fighting a war for hearts and minds while we're fighting a war for territorial control. Propaganda. Court dismissed. Standard psychological warfare. No, I insisted. Propaganda involves deception. Humans tell the truth about their capabilities, their intentions, and their principles. Then, they demonstrate that their claims are accurate through consistent action. It's far more effective than traditional deception-based psychological operations. She brought up communication intercepts from hegemony forces who had encountered human units. Our own personnel are beginning to question orders when they conflict with human demonstrated principles. Morale problems are increasing across all combat commands. Desertion rates have tripled in the past year. Strategic Coordinator Vexmat's voice carried dangerous harmonics. Are you suggesting our forces are being corrupted by exposure to human ideology? I'm suggesting that humans have demonstrated the practical superiority of their approach. Zexhai replied carefully. Our personnel can see that human methods achieve better results with lower casualties. When faced with that evidence, some are questioning whether our methods serve their actual interests. The implications were staggering. The hegemony's military effectiveness depended on absolute loyalty from forces who believed that hegemony methods were the best available. If that belief eroded, the entire system could collapse. What do you recommend? Maltex asked, and Zexhai detected something she had never heard in his voice before: uncertainty. This was the moment she had been dreading and anticipating since beginning her investigation. Everything she had learned pointed toward a single, terrifying conclusion. We have 3 options, she said, her voice steady despite her internal chaos. We can attempt to suppress human influence through increased military action. We could try to compete with human methods by reforming our own systems. Or we can negotiate some form of coexistence that acknowledges the legitimacy of both approaches. Military suppression would be problematic, Quexai noted. Our intelligence indicates that direct attacks on human territories would likely trigger defensive alliances with multiple species, including several that possess significant military capabilities. Reform would require abandoning 40,000 years of successful expansion doctrine, Vexmat added. The political implications would be substantial, which leaves negotiation, Maltex concluded. You're suggesting we treat this primitive species as equals? Zexhai felt the weight of history pressing down on her. The next words she spoke could determine the future of galactic civilization. I'm suggesting we acknowledge that they may not be as primitive as we assumed, she said quietly. Their technology might be simpler than ours, but their social structures appear to be more advanced. They've solved problems we're still struggling with. How to maintain unity across diverse populations, how to expand without creating resistance, how to exercise power without corrupting themselves. The chamber fell into contemplative silence. Each member of the High Command was processing implications that challenged everything they understood about their place in the galaxy. Finally, Supreme Commander Maltex spoke. Intelligence Specialist Zexhai, you will prepare a comprehensive analysis of human capabilities and intentions. Include specific recommendations for policy adaptation. You have 72 hours. Yes, Supreme Commander. And Zexhai, Maltex added, his voice carrying undertones she couldn't interpret. Remember that you are evaluating an existential threat to hegemony civilization. Your conclusions will determine whether we adapt to this new reality or eliminate it before it can spread further. As Zexhai left the chamber, she realized that her investigation had evolved far beyond its original parameters. She was no longer studying alien military doctrine. She was deciding the future of 2 civilizations whose approaches to governance, warfare, and interspecies relations were fundamentally incompatible. The humans had shattered everything she thought she knew about how power worked in the universe. Now she had to decide whether that shattering represented an opportunity for growth or a threat that required elimination. The weight of that decision was crushing. But as she began preparing her final report, Zexhai found herself thinking about the human prisoners she had met, the dignity they maintained even in captivity, and the hope they expressed for a future where their children might live in a galaxy governed by law rather than force. For the first time in her life, she began to understand what the humans meant when they talked about moral courage. Zexhai's final report lay before the assembled High Command like a weapon of mass destruction. 72 hours of intensive analysis had produced a document that would either revolutionize hegemony civilization or trigger the largest military campaign in galactic history. Supreme Commander Maltex studied the data streams with all 12 of his eyes, his massive form radiating the kind of dangerous stillness that preceded either profound decision-making or explosive violence. Around him, the other members of the High Command absorbed information that challenged 40,000 years of successful Imperial doctrine. "Your recommendations are unprecedented," Maltex finally said. Zexhai stood at attention, her sensory appendages trembling with nervous energy. "Yes, Supreme Commander. The situation requires unprecedented solutions. You're suggesting we abandon military conquest as our primary expansion method," Fleet Admiral Court observed, his tentacles writhing with agitation. "This contradicts everything we know about effective governance. I'm suggesting we acknowledge that our current methods are becoming counterproductive," Zexhai corrected. "Military conquest worked when we faced primitive species with limited communication capabilities. The galactic situation has changed." She activated the holographic display, showing a real-time map of known space. Red markers indicated hegemony territory, blue represented human-allied systems, and yellow marked neutral or contested regions. The pattern was troubling. Blue zones were expanding rapidly, while red zones showed increasing internal instability. "Human influence is spreading exponentially," she continued. "Not through military force, but through voluntary association. Species are choosing to join human alliances because they prefer human governance models." Intelligence Director Quexhai's cybernetic implants flickered as she processed the data. According to these projections, human influence will encompass 40% of known space within 50 years, without firing a single shot in aggressive warfare. 40% that we're currently losing through rebellion, desertion, and economic defection, Strategic Coordinator Vexmat added grimly. "Our control costs are increasing while our resource extraction is decreasing. The mathematics are unsustainable." Supreme Commander Maltex leaned forward, his voice carrying harmonics that indicated profound displeasure. "Are you suggesting the hegemony is failing?" Zexhai felt her survival instincts screaming at her to retreat, to soften her conclusions, to tell the leadership what they wanted to hear. But 3 months of studying human courage had changed something fundamental in her psychological matrix. "I'm suggesting the hegemony is evolving," she said firmly. "We can either guide that evolution or be destroyed by it." The chamber fell silent except for the subtle harmonics of the High Command's breathing apparatus. Zexhai could sense the complex emotions radiating from the assembly: fear, anger, confusion, and something that might have been desperate hope. "Explain your specific recommendations," Maltex commanded. Zexhai activated a new data stream, showing a detailed analysis of human governance structures. "The humans have developed something they call federal democracy. It allows for local autonomy within a framework of shared principles and mutual benefit. Member systems retain their cultural identity and political independence while contributing to collective security and economic development." "Sounds inefficient," Court protested. "How do you maintain central authority when every subordinate unit has independent decision-making capability?" "You don't maintain central authority," Zexhai replied. "You replace it with collective authority. Decisions are made by consensus among member systems rather than by imperial decree. It's slower for routine matters, but it's more stable and sustainable because every member has investment in the outcomes." She brought up comparative statistics showing governance efficiency metrics. Human systems show 97% compliance with collective decisions because those decisions are made through inclusive processes. Hegemony systems show 64% compliance with imperial directives, and that percentage is declining annually. Quexai's implants buzzed with activity. "You're describing a fundamental restructuring of our entire political system. The logistical implications alone would be staggering. The alternative implications are worse," Zexhai countered. She activated a projection showing economic and military trends over the next century. Current patterns indicate complete systemic collapse within 200 years. Resource extraction costs are exceeding resource yields. Military expenditures are consuming an unsustainable percentage of total economic output. Rebellion management requires increasing force allocation while producing decreasing stability. The projections were devastating. Even with conservative assumptions, the hegemony's expansion-based economy could not sustain itself much longer. The mathematics of imperial overextension were inexorable. What about military solutions? Vexmat asked, could we eliminate human influence through targeted campaigns? Zexai had anticipated this question and prepared her most dangerous analysis. Military action against human territories would trigger defensive alliances with at least 47 species, including 12 that possess planet-killer technology. The economic cost of such a campaign would exceed our total resource reserves. More importantly, military action would prove the human argument that we're a tyrannical force that must be resisted. She paused, letting the implications sink in. Military action against humans would transform them from a political alternative into a liberation movement. Every species that's ever resented hegemony authority would rally to their cause. Supreme Commander Maltex's voice carried undertones she had never heard before, something that might have been defeat. You're describing an impossible situation. We can't continue current policies, we can't reform our systems, and we can't eliminate the threat through military action. I'm describing a transition opportunity, Zexai corrected. The humans have offered something they call a galactic congresses, a forum where all species can participate in decisions that affect interspecies relations. We could join as founding members rather than being excluded as irrelevant. The concept hung in the air like an alien artifact. The idea of the hegemony participating in rather than dominating galactic governance was so foreign it seemed almost impossible to process. Participation implies equality, Cord observed. We would have no more authority than any primitive species with a single inhabited planet. We would have exactly as much authority as we could earn through contribution and cooperation, Zexai replied. The humans don't believe in inherited superiority. They believe in demonstrated competence. She activated another display showing human diplomatic protocols. In human systems, leadership is based on ability to generate positive outcomes for all participants. Leaders who fail to deliver benefits are replaced through peaceful processes. It's ruthlessly meritocratic but completely nonviolent. And our current leadership? Maltex asked quietly. The question carried implications that made Zexai's survival instincts scream warnings. She was being asked to evaluate the competence of the most powerful beings in known space while standing directly in front of them. Would be evaluated on the same basis as any other leadership, she said carefully. Contribution to collective welfare, ability to generate sustainable solutions, effectiveness at consensus building, and demonstration of ethical behavior. Intelligence Director Quexai's implants flickered rapidly as she processed the implications. You're describing a system where moral authority matters more than military power. I'm describing a system where moral authority becomes military power, Zexai corrected. When people believe their government serves their interests, they fight harder to defend it. When they believe their government exploits them, they look for opportunities to escape or rebel. She brought up the final component of her analysis: psychological profiles of human military personnel. Human soldiers show exceptional motivation and effectiveness because they believe they're fighting for principles worth defending. They're not fighting to maintain someone else's power. They're fighting to protect a system that benefits everyone. The data was overwhelming. Human forces consistently outperformed hegemony units, not because of superior technology or tactics, but because of superior morale. They fought harder because they had better reasons to fight. What specific transition steps do you recommend? Maltex asked, his voice carefully neutral. This was the moment Zexai had been preparing for since beginning her investigation. The next few minutes would determine whether the hegemony evolved or collapsed. Phase 1. Establish formal diplomatic relations with human territories and request inclusion in the Galactic Congress proposal. Phase 2. Begin implementing federal democratic structures in willing client systems as a trial program. Phase 3. Gradually transition from imperial administration to Confederate coordination based on demonstrated results. And if the results are negative? Vexmat asked. Then, we revert to current methods while they're still viable, Zexhai replied. But, based on human examples, I believe the results will be overwhelmingly positive. Supreme Commander Maltex rose from his platform, his imposing form casting shadows across the assembly. For several minutes, he stood in contemplative silence while the weight of decision settled across the chamber. Intelligence Specialist Zexhai, he finally said, you have presented analysis that challenges everything this organization represents. You're asking us to abandon proven methods for experimental alternatives based on the success of a species we've known for less than a year. Yes, Supreme Commander. You understand that if your recommendations prove incorrect, the consequences could include the complete destruction of hegemony civilization? Yes, Supreme Commander. But if we don't implement these recommendations, the consequences will definitely include the complete destruction of hegemony civilization. Maltex's eyes fixed on her with predatory intensity. And you believe this transition is worth the risk? Zexhai thought about everything she had observed. Human prisoners treated with dignity. Human soldiers fighting for principles rather than profit. Human civilians participating in decisions that affected their lives. Human leaders accepting responsibility for their failures while sharing credit for their successes. Supreme Commander, she said quietly, I believe this transition offers us something we've never had before, the possibility of being proud of what we are rather than simply afraid of what we might become. The silence that followed was profound and transformative. Zexhai could sense the fundamental shift occurring in the room as the High Command grappled with possibilities they had never previously considered. Finally, Supreme Commander Maltex spoke. Fleet Admiral Court, you will establish formal diplomatic contact with human authorities. Intelligence Director Quexhai, you will prepare a comprehensive analysis of federal democratic implementation procedures. Strategic Coordinator Vexmat, you will identify client systems suitable for trial governance programs. He paused, his gaze returning to Zexhai. And you, Intelligence Specialist, will serve as our primary liaison with human representatives. Your understanding of their civilization appears to be uniquely comprehensive. As the session concluded and the High Command dispersed to begin implementing the most radical transformation in galactic history, Zexhai found herself reflecting on the journey that had brought her to this moment. She had begun by studying human military efficiency and ended by witnessing the birth of a new model for interspecies civilization. The humans hadn't conquered the hegemony through superior force. They had conquered it through superior ideas. Their laws of war had indeed shattered everything she thought she knew about how power worked in the universe. But in place of her old certainties, they had offered something far more valuable. Hope for a future where strength came from cooperation rather than domination, where security came from justice rather than fear, and where the greatest victory was making enemies into friends rather than simply making them dead. As she prepared to contact General Morrison and begin negotiations for hegemony participation in the Galactic Congress, Zexhai realized that her species was about to learn the most important lesson humans had to teach. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is choose not to use your strength.